Hello, my name's Carl Irwin, and this is a hopefully a relatively short tutorial taking a look at a new wild and crazy concept that I've been messing around with in the Blender video sequence editor concerning rendering Z passes and also depth of field composites using only OpenGL output and rendering. And the idea here is that you can create some somewhat convincing Z-pass composited material and also depth of field effects using only OpenGL materials, only OpenGL rendering, and it can be rendered relatively instantaneously without the need for pre-rendering or waiting for the compositor to work. This is all done outside of the compositor, done using only GLSL viewport shading and the video sequence editor using several scenes and compositing them together in the VSE. So let me show you what's going on here. This is a demonstration of the concept, and it's not perfect, but it is pretty impressive, I think, anyway, what you can get away with. If you take a look here, you have a scene, there's a floor, a ground plane that has a texture on it, bump map texture. And we have these four spheres. They look like they have a rock texture on them. There's some soft shading there. And you can see that there appears to be this distance fall off going on, where the further away from the camera the objects are, the more occluded the objects become inside of what appears to be this atmosphere effect. You can also see that these objects, this object that's closer to the camera and the ground that's closer to the camera, has a what looks like a defocused blur on it. And these objects that are further away from this in-focus object are also appear to be out of focus. So we have created what looks like a depth of field, a narrow depth of field, in which objects at this certain plane from the camera are in focus and everything else is out of focus. And if I play this scene back, this animation, you can see as the camera moves forward, the objects that come into that plane of focus come into focus. Objects that move out of that plane go out of focus. And you can see that this object in the very back will come out of the depth in the atmosphere and out of occlusion from this atmosphere effect and come into a more clear view. You can see as the camera moves forward and then into focus, and then it will move back and into that Z depth kind of atmospheric effect. So this is, again, all created using OpenGL. There's no pre-rendering going on, and the refresh rate is approximately 4 or 5 seconds to refresh and only about 1 second to render using the OpenGL render from the video sequence editor. So this is somewhat of a procedural kind of effect, in that I could change the scene in any way and it would should automatically update as I render out the scene in the video sequence editor. So let's take a look and see what's going on here. If we look at the Blender file, you can see that I have OpenGL or GLSL shading enabled. I'm not going to get into exactly what that means. I have some other tutorials on my YouTube channel that explain that in greater detail. You can take a look at those. You can see that there is some soft shading going on here, and this is accomplished by using multiple sun lamps that are pointing in different directions. And these sun lamps are set to a very, very low intensity so as to emit several hard shadows that, when combined together, create a soft shadow. I also have an OpenGL point light in the scene, and as you know, if you've experimented with this before, the point light does not cast shadow. The point light only illuminates an object and then creates shadow on the opposite side of the object, but it does not cast shadow from one object to another. So I put this point light in there just kind of to increase some of the lighting in the scene, although it does not add for any shadowing effect from one object to another. That is accomplished using only sun lamps. So this is the scene set up. I am using some texture nodes in order to enable these textures in the scene. if we go back to the camera viewport and we play through our animation, you can see what's going on here. The camera, actually, I'm not going to do that because it's kind of slow, but I will just kind of point out throughout the scene that the camera moves forward and moves back in the scene. And this detail is quite amazing. OpenGL, GLSL rendering and texturing is very, very powerful, and I have been using it a lot more lately just because it looks so good. Now, if I click on only render, you can see the background is black. Not that that's relevant, but there is no background here in the scene. Now, I created another scene, and I call this the Z-Pass scene. And this is what it looks like. It essentially is all of the same objects. They've been duplicated in a new scene. If I turn on only render, you can see that the background is black. And what it looks like is a Z-Pass. If you know what a Z-Pass looks like, a Z-Pass is a render pass that calculates the distance objects are from the camera. And in this case, the further away the objects get from the camera, the darker they are until they turn completely black. So if we look around the scene, you can see what's going on here. Now, the way this is accomplished, if I turn off the only render, you can see I have some point lights. And these OpenGL point lights are parented to the camera. So as the camera moves forward in the scene, the point lights move with the camera. Now again, point lights do not cast shadow from one object to another, and we're using this kind of flaw in the point lighting to our advantage. So what's happening here is the lights are illuminating the objects that are closer to the camera, and the further away the objects are, the more the light falls off, and it turns grayscale gradient to black. And this is essentially a Z-Pass. It really is, in essence, in all the ways that matter, this is just a Z-Pass, so that we are using the light to demonstrate that objects closer to the camera are whiter and objects that are further away are darker. They are black. Or turn gray and then to black. So this is, it's not identical to a Z-Pass, but it essentially is the same thing. We're using our lights to create this effect. I'll show you how we'll use that in a minute. If we go to this other pass that I made, I call it a depth of field pass. Now, what I tried to do was use my Z-Pass that I created and then tweak it in the video sequence editor in order to isolate this more central plane. And that's essentially what happens in the compositor when you use a defocus node. The defocus node calculates a central point where the focal point for the camera is set. And it would create a mask that probably looks something like this, where we have this central area that is illuminated or lighter color, and then everything else beyond and in front of that plane is darker. Now, the way this is accomplished, if I turn off the only render tab there, you can see that I just made an array of point lights set to very low intensity. And they are parented again to the camera, and as the camera moves forward, this array of lights moves and illuminates this plane, this point in space in our scene from the camera. And we're going to use this as a mask to create a depth of field effect. Now, there's probably a lot of other ways you could do this. One idea that I had that I didn't do here would be to put an empty out in this space and parent all of the lights to the empty and then parent the empty to the camera. And by doing that, you could move the point around the scene in relationship to the camera, and that would be like doing a rack focus on a camera where you're changing the focal point while the camera moves or while the scene plays out. So that's another thing that maybe you could try in a project, or maybe I'll try. If you have any interest in trying this at all, you may not. I'm just kind of showing this to you, not necessarily with the intent that you might even bother to use it. But let's go back to our camera view, and we'll enable the only render button. So this is not perfect. You can see that the shape of our illumination is not exactly perfect. It's not really a Z-Pass in reality, but it does emulate that kind of technique, and it can be useful in terms of compositing and for what we're going to use it for. So these are the three passes that I have. We'll go back to our main pass, and I'm going to go to the video sequence editor, and we'll take a look at how we put this together. So I'm going to use all of these scenes in the video sequence editor and use some compositing tricks, some of the effects that are in the video sequence editor to kind of create that animation that we just looked at. I'm going to enable each one of these tracks one by one to show you how this is put together. So the first track will enable is a background image, and this is just a bluish kind of picture image with a gradient applied to it that looks kind of like a vignette, and we're going to use this as our background image. On top of that, I have the main scene, and if we enable that, we can see what that looks like. This is just an OpenGL preview render with the texture enabled, and you can see that this is essentially what we saw in the 3D viewport of the scene, the first scene, with a black background. Now, I could set this to alpha over, but we're going to find a more clever way to composite this foreground with the background that will enable what appears to be an atmosphere using our Z-Pass. Okay, so I'm going to set this back to cross. The next track is the Z-Pass itself. So this is the first Z-Pass. Again, with the parts that are close to the camera are white, the parts that are further away turn gray and then black in the background. And then I'm going to duplicate this Z-Pass, and I'm going to put another instance on here, and the duplicated one is going to be inverted. And here's how I accomplish that. I add a curves adjustment, and on the main track to the curves adjustment, I take the 2 points that are on here. The one on the left, by default, would be down on the bottom, and the one on the right would be up on the top. This is what the track would look like normally, but I'm going to invert them. So I'm going to take the highlights, and I'm going to move them to the bottom, and I'm going to take the low, the blacker part, the darker section, and I'm going to move that up, and that, in effect, will invert our track. It's an identical inversion, or rather a complementary inversion of the first Z-Pass that we rendered out, okay, or that we are rendering out in real time. Now, here's how we're going to use this. I'm going to take my second Z-Pass, my inverted one, and I'm going to select my background. So I'll select that, right-click. Then I'm going to hit Shift, right-click on my inverted Z-Pass. Then I would add an effect strip. I'm going to use the multiply effect. Now, I cannot use an alpha effect in the video sequence editor that will allow me to map my Z-Pass to the alpha channel. That does not work in the video sequence editor. That would work in the compositor, but it does not work here. Instead, I'm going to use the multiply effect. So I've already done it, and this is what it looks like once we've enabled it. It looks something like this, and this is essentially a mask, so that the lighter parts of my Z-Pass enable the background image, and then the darker parts leave kind of a cutout in the image. And you can see the parts where there's a grayscale gradient, it falls off. Okay, so it goes from illuminated to black. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my first Z-Pass, I'll select that, and then I will hit Shift and select my main scene, and then I will add another multiply effect to that, and this is what that one will look like once we add it. This is whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. Let's try this again. Select my next scene here. We're going to set it to cross, and we'll enable it, and this is what the next scene looks like. Okay, so now I've applied my Z-Pass to my main scene, and you can see that the parts that were forward, that are white, are illuminated, and the parts that are in the back, or towards the back, that are grayscale gradient and then black, are kind of darker. They fade out in the distance. Okay, now here's what I discovered. We can mix these two outputs, these two multiply outputs, by taking the top one and setting the blend mode to add. Now let me explain what's going to happen here. These two outputs are mirrors of each other. They are positive and negative versions of each other. So the part that is grayscaled in the middle of both of these, when added together, will produce the correct luminance for the scene. They cancel each other out, and they produce a correct luminance. So let's set this to add, and you see what happens. This is kind of neat. You see that we have the Z-pass applies a fall-off effect once we add these two together, okay? And this updates automatically as we move through the scene. If I click on another area, you can see as the object moves forward in space, it comes out of that atmospheric effect, okay? Pretty neat, and it updates very quickly, only a couple seconds. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an adjustment layer. We're going to use this adjustment layer. It's in the effect strip possibilities here. You select adjustment layer. This will tie everything that we've done so far together into a new strip. And this is important because I want to be able to apply some effects just to this entire composite. And in order to do that, we have to add an adjustment layer. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this adjustment layer and I'm going to add a glow effect. Okay, and this is what it will look like once we tweak it. Let me enable it. A glow effect should, by default, look something more like this. So it looks like the original image, and then all of the highlights are illuminated and they glow. So there's kind of a blurring effect that on all of the highlights, and then the highlights are added again to the image, and it causes this glowing effect. Now what I can do is click on this option for only boost. And by doing that, it will show only the blurred layer of the glow effect without adding it back onto the image. Okay? And you can see, in essence, this is just a blur effect. What I do is I set my threshold to 0, so it blurs everything, not just the highlights, but all of the parts of the scene. And I set my boost factor up a little bit to 0.8 because the glow effect is not a true blur. It does lose some of the lower elements in the scene, and they get darker. We don't want that to happen. So I'm going to set my boost up a little bit, and then I'm going to increase my blur distance a little bit to 7, and then I'm going to add a curves adjustment. I'm going to bump up the low colors just a little bit, increase them to compensate for the lost luminance. Okay, so now I've got a blurred version of my adjustment layer, of my full composite. Okay, now I've got two more tracks to work with. I've got my original, my composited track, and I've got my blurred track. Now I'm going to add my depth of field tracks. Okay, so let's select the depth of field track, my depth of field scene, and I'll enable that. I added a curves adjustment, and I added a curve here to just increase the contrast of my depth of field scene, so I get a whiter color and a little bit more of a less subtle gradient. Then I'm going to duplicate my depth of field scene, and I will invert it. Just like I did with my Z-pass scene, I apply a curves adjustment, and I move these points to the polar opposite so that we bring the low section up, the high section down, and we end up with this inversion. So now, think about what I've got. I've got an adjustment layer with the full composite of the Z-pass. I've got a glow, which is a blurred version of that same adjustment layer. Then I've got my depth of field, and I've got my inverted depth of field. So now I'm going to apply these depth of field passes much the way I did my Z-passes. So I'll select my top, my inverted depth of field, and I'll select my adjustment layer, or rather my glow layer. So glow layer first, then the depth of field, and then I will apply a multiply effect. Okay, and that is what this looks like if I enable it. And you can see what's happened. Rather, I select my depth of field pass, excuse me, and my adjustment layer. And this is what I end up with. So it's a mask where the part that is illuminated in the depth of field plane, the focal point, is now in the in-focus adjustment layer. And the rest of it is darkened out. And there is a gradient there, a gradual falling off from that mask. Now I'm going to take my glow layer, and I'll select my inverted depth of field pass, and then I will add another multiply effect. And if we go to this effect and let me set it to cross for a second. This is what it will look like once you apply that multiply layer. It's the inversion of the other multiply layer, and I'm going to set it to add. The blend mode will be set to add. So these two multiplier layers will composite together, and here we have what appears to be a depth of field effect, where there is a section that is in focus and then everything else is out of focus or blurred. Now, is this authentic? No, it's not authentic. This is not truly how a depth of field effect is created using the defocus node in the compositor. But it's close enough. We are cheating. We're kind of cheating this effect, and we're getting away with quite a lot here by cheating. Now, the last thing I do is I add one more adjustment layer with some color correction, and I add just a color balance correction, and this is the final output that I get. Now you can see as I click onto another part in the scene, it takes about 5 seconds for it to refresh, and then from here I can hit my OpenGL render button, and it renders in about 1 second. This is remarkably fast, and this is full resolution. 1280 by 720 output, and from here I can render my full animation. And again, this is somewhat procedural in that I could change elements in my scene so long as all of the objects from my Z pass and my depth of field pass are tied to my objects in my main pass. This is all procedural. It will update automatically and refresh still in only about 4 or 5 seconds and render in about 1 second. So this is a really wild and crazy way to kind of create these effects using the video sequence editor and OpenGL rendering and get a fairly realistic result. I'm still playing with this, still trying to tweak it and come up with more efficient ways to do it and better results. Once you understand the principle, you can set the scene up very quickly and come up with these kinds of results using OpenGL. And again, to any of those people out there that might be developers for Blender, I can't stress to you enough the importance of OpenGL rendering and other compositing platforms that are on the market, other proprietary systems. And I think it really would be worth some time spending developing the OpenGL capabilities in Blender. I know that we have a lot of work going into cycles and using video cards to render in cycles, and there's a lot of great development on that, and the speed is increasing all the time. But truly, OpenGL is quite powerful and is being used more in compositing in other systems. And it already is very powerful in Blender. A few things that could be tweaked and fixed in that rendering platform, and we could have some amazing fast rendering capability in Blender. One thing in particular I'm thinking of is the alpha transparency issues that we have in OpenGL right now, where it only renders 1 bit alpha transparency when you have multiple objects in a scene with alpha transparency in the material. So anyway, that's my soapbox. We need more development in OpenGL. There's lots of promise here. And I also want to point out that I did not use anything in here in a manner other than what it is intended for. What I did, though, is I used the combination of various effects when working together to produce some other than commonly thought of results when you think about the video sequence editor. And that is the beauty of technology, and the true essence of progression in technology is that technology progresses not when we use things what they were thought of or intended for, but when we use software and hardware in ways that it was not necessarily intended for, but rather pushing it to its limitations and pushing it to do what it can do rather than what is intended to do. And I encourage you in all of your work to try to find new creative outside of the box ways to create new results. And by doing that, we come up with better and better software and better hardware every day. So that's my tutorial on video sequence editor compositing and OpenGL rendering and Z-Pass rendering using point lights in Blender. Hopefully you find some use out of this. If nothing, hopefully I've entertained you at least for a few minutes here as you watch me ramble on about these possibilities in the Blender video sequence editor. So good luck to you. I hope you find this useful, and I wish all of you happy blending.